I'm really happy to be talking with Jacob Goldfarb today from Goldfarm Canada. We've talked a number of times over the years. He's another Canadian grower here. So to get things started, Jacob, I'm just hoping you could introduce yourself, talk a little bit about your operation and how long you've been doing this.
Sure. Thanks, Chris, for having me again. It's always a pleasure talking to you about this stuff. Yeah, so I got started in this as a side hustle April 2019, and I came to it through, I had a pretty keen interest first in permaculture and sustainability, and then just discovering different facets of that through research. I was really into aquaponics for a good while, and then spin farming when I discovered Curtis Stone, and then I went through a bunch of different permutations, and then just happened upon a YouTube video about microgreens, and I felt like at the time I was living in a one-bedroom apartment in Toronto, in downtown Toronto, and I thought, hey, this is something I actually have the space for. And so that was the beginning. I think, as a lot of growers do, I measure things in terms of tray capacity of trays that you can grow. So I had one rack with a capacity of 20 trays when I started. And I have a bit of a background in working in kitchens and being a cook. My plan was always to sell to restaurants, and I felt like I was well suited and positioned to have conversations with chefs. So it started there, and once I had some success in the neighborhood, it just went from there. That was my proof of concept. My partner and I ended up moving to Guelph, which is about an hour west of Toronto. So I went from one rack in my kitchen to 6 racks. So I went from 20 trays to 120 trays because I could devote a whole room to growing. And
So
then
this is still in a one-bedroom apartment in Toronto?
we moved to
Okay.
Guelph to a 3-bedroom apartment.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
So sorry. Thank you for the clarification, for asking for the clarification. Yes, we moved to a 3-bedroom apartment in Guelph. I had a whole bedroom that I laid down waterproof flooring and made sure it was good to go. And then I actually had a separate it was a workroom. So I had 2 rooms that I could use. One was where I would sew the trays and do the harvesting, and the other was where I had all the racks. So from 20 trays to 120 trays, it was at that time when we went into lockdown during the pandemic back in the spring of 2020. And I don't want to preempt you here, but this is the point at which it was the go, no go in terms of doing this doing it full time, giving myself over and deciding to do that. This was going to be my real business and give it a go.
So you had to make that decision during the pandemic then?
Yeah. So what happened coincidentally was literally the Friday of lockdown. I had given my notice 2 weeks prior, and the Friday of lockdown was my last day of work at my previous job. It forced upon me, really. I hadn't fully committed to it, but 120 tray capacity, that's a decent business. And it was a decent business for me already at that time as a part-time thing I was doing on the side. I was living in Guelph and I was still working in Toronto. I didn't want to commute anymore after I gave up the job, and I wasn't having a lot of luck finding good work in Guelph. So I just said, you know what, I'm just gonna throw myself into this and really give it a real try. And so by the fall of 2020, I had leased my first commercial space. It was less than 450 square feet, very small room, essentially in a multi-unit facility here in Guelph. I built racks myself using lumber and rubber membrane to protect the wood, but I went from 120 tray capacity to 300 trays in that very small space. We just found ways to maximize every square inch of the volume in that room, but it worked quite well for quite a long time. And it was basically, I want to say, winter 2022. By winter 2022, spring 2023, it was obvious that we literally hit the ceiling. I wasn't able to get any more clients because we were out of room. So I made the decision that after I would say I had already made the commitment, I saw it was a viable business. I was able to pay myself and an employee I made an even bigger, took a little bit of a risk, took out a loan from the bank, and really invested a lot in this. And now, as of May 2023, we leased a 2,200 square foot warehouse space, also here in Guelph, and we went from a 300 tray capacity to we have now almost 2,000. So I didn't want to take another small step. I wanted to take a significant step so that we wouldn't have to keep iterating and iterating. And I wanted to invest quite a bit here to make this the HQ for a good period of time.
Nice. So you've got a 2,000 tray capacity. Are you producing that amount right now?
No, I wanted to have the room. I've always taken a very conservative approach to growth. I don't ever want to bite off more than I can chew, both in terms of labor and just in terms of managing client base. So I wanted to give myself enough room to grow into this space. And so now we're using, I would say, somewhere around 35 to 40% of the capacity, but we still have quite a bit of room to grow.
Nice. What kind of crops are you growing these days?
We grow over 50 different varieties of microgreens. I would say, as far as I know, we have the broadest product line in Ontario for sure. And since we sell 100% to restaurants, that's part of why we offer such a diverse range of products. And of course, we still grow the typical, what I would call more starter microgreens like pea shoots, sunflower, radishes, almost any brassica you could name. We grow them, a lot of different mustard greens. And then I think really what sets us apart is the breadth of our culinary herbs and other specialty greens, nasturtium, red vein sorrel, and other longer growing crop types.
Yeah, so this is a really unique aspect, I think, of what Goldfarm does. I'm all about like how short of a cycle can I get and how many different crops can I get on that cycle? That's my thing. And a lot of that comes from, as it is with a lot of microgreens growers, you have a limited number of space, so that quick turnover is important. And so you've got these longer cycle microgreens along with some of the shorter cycle ones. So I wonder if you can just talk in general about how is that different in terms of managing those crops because of their duration, things like that.
Yeah, the managing the crops, really the big thing to consider is nutrition and how those crops, how you get them to harvestable size, feeding them properly. That's really the biggest consideration. Yeah, yes, we're not as concerned with space. We have enough room that we can afford to do these longer grows, because this is what our clients demand, right? This is the kind of stuff that they want. That's the commitment that we've made, and really we have implemented tools. We've been growing all the long varieties for quite some time, but other than fertilizer and our fertigation program, we also use software now to track all of our grows.
And one thing that stands out for me, and we'll talk about space in a little bit, is when I think of a tray. So you mentioned we think of, as growers, we think about these units of trays, but there's the tray and the space it takes up, and then there's the tray and the time it takes up. When I think about that, how does that change how you organize your space? When I think about growing crops like radish or sunflower, a lot of these crops, I harvest a crop and another one just replaces it right away. And it's on this really simple cycle. But you might have multiple generations of some of these things as you've got something coming to its end, something near the middle of its maturity, something at the beginning. I imagine you might even have 4, 5, or 6 generations of some things going. So what does that look like in terms of space management for you?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think Goldfarm is quite unique in how we approach production and sales. Don't think a lot of other growers follow the same ethos that we do. We take orders in an additive method, meaning that we only grow to order. We work with standing orders with all of our clients, meaning, yes, if I have something that takes 3 or 4 weeks to grow, I have at least 3 or 4 generation of that on the racks at any given time. managing that in terms of the physical space, you can think of it like conveyor belt. We use flood tables. They're 4 foot by 8 foot flood tables. They have a capacity of 16 trays each. We try and group like with like varieties. That could be like with like. Definitely has to be with in terms of lighting schedules and also in terms of watering schedules. All of the basil, for example, let's say we use 3 different flood tables. So we have different generations on different flood tables. And as one comes out, when the next comes out of germination, they just keep moving up like a conveyor belt. So the oldest ones move up and we slot the new ones in the lowest level. And that kind of works all over the farm. We label, we use the racking to we use like magnetic labels to indicate which crops go where. In such a large space, we have microclimates here and there that we're still where there's more airflow and less airflow, a little bit warmer, a little bit cooler. So we have a map of where everything goes in the system, and we just rotate things in and out as needed.
So your crops are actually changing location as they progress through the maturity.
It's not a major change. It's about because we only have about a foot difference, a foot of space between the bottom of the lower table and the bottom of the table above. So they're only moving a foot up or a foot down,
Right.
but generally staying in the same vicinity in the system.
So do you make changes to, for example, I think of maybe a basil, whatever, it's moving up in this racking system, maybe over several weeks, it moves up 2 or 3 tiers. Do you make any changes? Lighting stay the same, temperature stay the same, anything like that?
We haven't gone to that length, that precise length. We installed an HVAC system which keeps the room pretty steady in terms of humidity and temperature. So we don't really change anything. We don't change the lighting schedule. All we do is just we have been adding a supplemental fertilizer to those longer growing crops. However, as we move away from hand watering, which is something that we're working on right now, we are doing experiments with other fertilizers that we can mix in when we open new bales of soil, rather than having to introduce fertilizer later in the grow.
So you've mentioned nutrition quite a bit, and it makes a lot of sense that you've got a small amount of soil, you've got a longer cycle, so there's going to need to be more nutrition there. Are there other differences or other sort of cultivation differences you do between the longer cycle crops and the shorter cycle crops like radish, sunflower, and that? Nutrition comes to mind first thing for me. I wonder about soil type, soil depth, lighting schedules, things like that. I wonder what's different. And I ask this, I mean, I know I'm supposed to be somewhat of an expert, but I really go towards those shorter cycle crops. And I think about, if I am growing a longer cycle crop, it's going to be in there more time, but I wonder about the other things that I might want to or have to adjust in order to get that optimum crop on a cycle that's 3 or 4 times as long as what I'm used to.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So I would say the first thing to consider is just seed density. I'll grow shorter cycle crops at a much more dense rate, even relatively than longer cycle crops. Now, that's also because with longer cycle crops, I'm pushing them past the cotyledon phase. I want those true leaves. People will still sell cilantro micros, for example, either no true leaf or a really small true leaf, whereas we're really pushing, I want that true leaf to be well established when I'm selling that cilantro, because that's what chefs want. That's what I think looks the best and is going to represent that on when you're looking at it on a plate, because that's how myself and my clients are thinking about it. So seed density is a big factor. More and more, we're realizing that the tray depth is a factor. Since the very beginning, I've always used shallow trays. I just find it easier when it comes to harvesting. But I had some deep trays lying around, and we were seeing some issues with a few of, especially the longest growing crops. And we've noticed that just changing them to deeper trays has essentially resolved a lot of the issues we were seeing. We weren't sure if it was nutrient deficiencies or what, but sometimes it seems just the depth, and whether that has to do with those varieties just liking the roots, liking more depth, or the increased volume of soil may just mean more nutrients are available. I don't really know how to figure that out, but it definitely has made a difference. Fertigation, tray depth, seed density, watering schedules, those are all really crucial things to consider when you're growing longer crops.
Yeah, those are some interesting. I've experimented with tray depth quite a bit as well. And I wonder if I think a lot of the short cycle crops, they have rooting systems that can really adapt to that shallow soil. And when you get into the longer crops, maybe some of them tend more towards a taproot or things like that. Yeah, that might be something nice to explore a little bit. Now, you talked a little bit about these longer cycle crops being demand driven. So I wonder, you're selling a variety of things. Was it that you saw more demand for those crops, so you shifted more in that direction, or did you try to push those longer cycle crops as well to differentiate yourself from what a lot of other microgreen growers were doing?
Yeah, more the latter, I would say. Restaurants will tend to always want, crops. They may not be your basic crops, but I still consider them that, like basil and cilantro. Yes, they're a little bit of a longer grow, but a lot of microgreen growers grow those. So I don't necessarily want to call them basic crops, but they're definitely more in demand and more ubiquitous than even other herbs. So really, we just wanted to differentiate ourselves. I was working with chefs I know, and the chefs that I work with, to change their menus really frequently, seasonally, or as their imagination, as they get inspired to do so. I wanted to have a broad catalog for them to choose from, to as an add-on to what we're already doing, to give them more options. Just our whole philosophy and I don't know if it's necessarily our mission. The idea is giving chefs, or helping uh, provide inspiration for chefs, giving them ingredients and different tools and things that they can work with when they're considering how to plate their dishes.
Right. So out of these longer cycle crops, what are a few that have really become your favorites over the past couple of years?
There's no doubt that nasturtium is our best selling crop. We're getting to the point where we can keep up, but it sometimes I said we generally work with standing orders. I do have some clients that will reach out to me here and there. They don't want to get something every week, and I'm getting to the point where I'm having to tell them that we're sold out in any given week. But nasturtium is just clearly our best seller. I've really enjoyed bringing on micro mint. I was really daunted by mint when I first did trials, because it seemed to be an incredibly long grow. And just like you, even though we grow a lot of longer crops, my mission is still to grow those to get them to harvest size as short as possible. So we're constantly, doing different things and testing how we can do that. But yeah, micro mint, lemon balm, and anise hyssop are great ones. We recently added purslane, which, the size that chefs want it does take quite a while to grow, and we're still dialing it in. It's not the easiest crop to get perfect. Yeah, I would say those are a few of our kind of more key longer growing crops.
So, as you're discussing some of these crops, I'm familiar with all of them, and a few of them to me are annoying invasive weeds, as many high-end crops are. And what comes to mind is there a point at which you start to implement seasonally, reminding people that you are in Toronto, and for a good part of the year, Toronto is very cold and things don't grow. But it seems there's a point at which having an outdoor growing space might be a good complement to the indoor growing space, where some of those, some of these crops that do, I mean, once you've got mint and lemon balm and purslane and all these, you've got them. They manage themselves. So has that been something on your radar, potentially having a complementary outdoor space?
There's two thoughts I'm having here. One is yes. However, the way you are talking about it, in terms of once lemon balm or mint gets established, they just go nuts. That's no longer really a microgreen, though. yes, we could cut and come again if we had an outdoor space, but they still want to be able to use a relatively petite leaf on a plate, and letting them go outside, it would be very hard to provide that. So I think there's still an element of control that we would want to have there. Having said that, 100%, I'm hoping that the next time we need to scale up the business, or the next move, which I'm hoping it'll be a little while now before we need to do that, but definitely something that I've been dreaming about, is having multiple types of growing facilities on one property. So first of all, having the business own the property, a few acres, whatever that is, having a similar fully indoor warehouse type space so we can continue to do microgreens the way we're doing now, having a greenhouse space so that we can do our edible flowers, maybe not year round, but certainly a good portion of the year, and a fully outdoor space for several reasons, including specialty greens that require that just won't grow in any other environment, and also edible flowers that don't grow well. So right now, the way we do our edible flowers, we do them generally in fabric pots, or we do them in limited space outdoors where they're just producing every week. We cut whatever comes up, and then they're flowers that are productive enough that we generally have enough for for a harvest every week. However, what a lot of chefs want, and many of my chefs are not keen on edible flowers because they feel that they don't add anything when it comes to flavor to a dish. And anybody that's familiar with edible flowers probably knows that most edible flowers don't really have a lot of flavor. You'd lose them in a bowl of lettuce. They would look good, but they wouldn't really taste. They don't really provide flavor. But there are many greens that we grow as microgreens or vegetables that their flowers do have flavor. So I get a lot of chefs asking me for fennel flowers, chive flowers, arugula flowers, mustard flowers, basil flowers, cilantro flowers, any of those, mostly herbs, right? Again, because they carry that same flavor. But those types of plants, you'd have to grow successive generations very close to one another in order to get a quantity of production that would allow for regular weekly sales. So I would need to grow them in a field. I wouldn't really be able to grow those the way that I do now in order to have the amount of production I would need. So yeah, fully outdoor space is definitely in the cards and would be a huge asset to what I'm doing with this business.
Nice. Yeah. So this is a good trend. You did this so well. You transitioned so well there, Jacob. I'm very impressed with that. Let's talk about space. You've talked about moving into a new space, and you've gone through many spaces. So I wonder if you could just, you said, or when we were prepping for this, you've been in 4 different spaces. So I wonder if you can just quickly go through those 4 different spaces and just what they were.
Yep.
Yeah, and then we'll get into some other stuff after that.
Okay, so just really quickly, 1 bedroom, like 1 rack with a 20 tray capacity in my 1 bedroom apartment in Toronto. 6
and
racks.
where was that rack in that 1 bedroom apartment?
It was in my kitchen. It was in my kitchen.
Okay.
Then the third bedroom of a 3 bedroom apartment in Guelph, plus a workroom where I was able to have a stainless steel table and shelving and stuff. So 120 tray capacity there. And then the third space was our first commercial space. It was about 430 square feet, but we had a 300 tray capacity. And then our current commercial space, which is about 2,200 square feet, and we have almost 2,000 tray capacity.
Right. So we talked earlier about, we as microgreens growers look at everything in the context of a tray. I actually think about it as the space a tray takes up as opposed to the tray itself. And we can come back to that because there's a time piece to that, how long that tray is in that space. So what's coming to mind for me is, was your need to grow into bigger spaces? I mean, 4 spaces in 5 years is a lot of moves. How much of that was related to the fact that you have a lot of these longer cycle crops, and therefore you need to have more trays going to meet your sequence of harvests over a several week or several month period?
Yeah, that's a very astute observation. And for sure, like we're up to, say we have to grow 16 trays of basil a week, or we're harvesting 16 trays of basil a week. That's, 64, potentially 64 slots, as you put it, that are being taken up. So certainly that was a major part of the reason why we did hit the ceiling in the last commercial space. But that's our model. That's our model in terms of our marketing model and our sales model. That just it's not a compromise I'm willing to make because of the structure, because of the way our market is structured. Yeah.
So I remember your transition into a new space. I think I tried to rope you into some other interviews, and you're like, "Not now." So I know what that's like. So I wonder if we can start with um, when you were looking for a new. So you're in a warehouse space, you're in this commercial space, and in your last thing. I think the transition from your house to a commercial space is a very obvious transition. Some of it's about space, but some of it's about, honey, when do we get that bedroom back?
It's also about legitimacy as a business. Not that I have clients coming to my space very frequently. I give tours here and there. Generally, it's just staff that are in the space. But as a business, you can't be inspected by the health inspector if you're growing out of your house. So it's technically a little bit of a gray area, and a lot of people don't care. It's not a big deal. The bigger you get, the more attention you're going to have on you, and the more you have to consider those things just from a business perspective. So I think that is a big factor when it comes to considering the space, especially when you're moving from growing at home to a commercial space.
Absolutely. So I'm going to a little bit of a side as I transition to this next question. You mentioned your time working in kitchens before, and I know that connected you to the restaurant industry. So you know what chefs want, you know how kitchens operate. That makes it an easier market to tap into. But I have to imagine that time working in kitchens taught you a lot about using space. Kitchens are often tight. I was a bartender in a previous life, and I feel when I transitioned into microgreens growers, there was a lot of transferable skills there about how you set things up to be ergonomic and quick, how you make use of limited space, how you use that vertical space. So I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that before I get into this. Do you feel that was an aspect of how you were able to make use of these spaces and evolve through these spaces from that experience?
Yeah, 100%. In any type of farming situation, labor is the biggest expense. And so the more efficiencies you can find, the more streamlined things are, whether that's with regards to the way you're using space or just your processes, that's going to be an asset. Definitely, I would say more so than focus on space, definitely a focus on working as efficiently as possible is something that has been baked in and is really a part of my thought process all the time. And now that we have several staff members, it's something that I encourage everyone to bring to mine and my farm manager's attention. If they see ways to improve efficiency, if they see ways to save us time or energy or whatever that is, we are always all ears. It's every footstep taken that you can save is money back in your pocket when it comes to labor expenses. Efficiency is the name of the game always.
Yeah, absolutely. So, when thinking about, there's a point at which you need to start thinking about a new space, you need to start looking for that space. I've grown crops on a dozen different spaces over the span of my life now. So, when I'm thinking about moving to a new growing or farm space, I have a particular set of things in mind. I have the ideal, what I can settle with, what I cannot settle with. When we're talking microgreens, we're usually talking from moving from one building to another. So there are these indoor facilities. And I'm not going to discount the experience we get from growing in different rooms in our houses because that is valuable. But you move from those and you had some warehouse space, then you had to move into the next warehouse space. So doing that, and I know you're methodical, I wonder about what are the key things you were looking for in this new space? I know there's some obvious things, but what were things like, okay, if we're going to do this model, this is what the space needs to have specifically for us and our unique structure?
Yeah, the funny thing is, I had that moment that most people who are shopping for houses or their own personal living spaces have, where you need to have that moment of walking into a space and just instantly having that feeling of yes, that this is it. When I did finally have that after a fairly exhaustive search, I was looking for a concrete shoebox. Like I was looking for just a big angular space. And there's two parts of that. One is the ceiling height. I wanted a generous ceiling height to achieve the verticality that I wanted, and the other was just a long straight shot, again to accommodate a system that's in line, and this has to do with plumbing when it comes to adding automation, automated watering, which is something that we introduced in this iteration of the farm. Those were the major factors. Other little things like storage space. I wanted to have an office space or a break room and an overhead door. Those were the major factors. That was about it though. Location, I just wanted it within the city limits. But yeah, those were the major factors physically about the space.
And were you hoping to find something that had pretty much all the HVAC, plumbing, electrical you need, or were you willing to do that investment to get what you needed?
I knew it was going to take some investment to get a space to where I needed it to be. There aren't really it would be nearly impossible to find a space that was already set up for indoor vertical farming. Maybe HVAC. This place didn't have it. I'm sure I could have found a place that did. That wasn't a make or break for me. I actually didn't even install HVAC at the outset. The previous tenant was making chocolate covered almonds, and I figured if they're doing chocolate in the summer in Ontario and they don't have HVAC, then probably we'll be okay. Not taking into account how hot the summers are getting and the fact that our lights generate heat, etc. I did have to bite the bullet, and luckily, just before the big heat waves here, we completed the installation of the HVAC system. But we had to do a few other things. I wanted to install a powerful inline fan for exhaust to pull air through. So again, if you imagine, we're in like a long rectangular box. So we have louvers set into the window in the front of the building that are wired in series with our exhaust fan. So when the exhaust fan turns on, and that's triggered by a temperature and humidity sensor, when the fan turns on, the louvers open, so we're drawing fresh air right through the space. That we had to get a building permit to bash a hole through the back wall to put that in. We had to get a building permit so that we had to drill up some of the concrete flooring because we had to put in a floor drain for the plumbing for the system. So there were a bunch of projects that needed to happen to get the space to be ready. They weren't, I don't want to say that they weren't significant, but the cost of the racking and flood tables and other big pieces of equipment were far more expensive than any of the construction work that had to happen.
Right. How do you heat that space? And there's a lot of options in warehouse spaces. Some of them are great if you're a mechanic working on things, but there's a certain way, many certain ways you might want to heat the space for your crops. So I wonder about how you're doing that.
So we took possession May of last year. We weren't able to start growing until September. So that's how long it took us to do the build out. We also had to be out of our old space by the end of September. So that was like a drop dead date. But I thought that was enough of a runway to get it all done. And it was still down to the wire on some things. So let that be a lesson to anybody considering this size and type of a move. It's always going to take longer than you think, even when you give yourself 5 months. Sorry, what was I?
Heating.
Heating, yes. So there was an existing block heater, a ceiling mounted natural gas heater that was in place when we took over the space. So we have since, in doing the HVAC install that we did, we intentionally oversized it. So that heater was removed, and we instead have two furnaces that are connected to two air conditioning units.
Nice. And then I want to come back briefly to ceiling height. I think a lot about ceiling height in these indoor spaces because you want some of that vertical space for sure, but there's a point at which that vertical space is there's all this other space you need to heat, need to remove humidity from, or add humidity to, depending where you are. What ceiling height did you get, and how I know you wanted height? Is it ideal, or is it not as tall as you want, a little taller than you'd like? Where is that at?
It's actually pretty ideal. Right up to the ceiling is 15 feet. There are beams that take up about a foot or so of that. So I would say the system is, I want to say it's 12. I want to say the uprights are about 12 feet high, maybe a little bit more. I can't remember offhand, but yeah, it's fairly ideal. We were able to get 9 vertical layers in that. That's works out. So initially my thought was to do, we're using pallet racking, and we had to get specific pallet racking that could accommodate the width of the 4 foot by 8 foot flood tables that we use. Initially, I was looking for a really long space so that we could just do one run of racks. But I was going to have to make a compromise if we were only doing one run. I wasn't going to quite get to the capacity that I wanted to get to. So we ended up sandwiching 2 runs back to back. So that did present some issues. Like, basically, I can never again get to the inside of my system to work on things without taking the flood tables out and climbing in there. But that's fine because of the way that we've set it up. So 2 sets of pallet racks side by side. We have over 100 individual flood tables in that space. And like I say, 9 layers. I think that's fairly good in terms of using the whole height. And logistically, we aren't using the highest levels. We're going to work our way up. It's obviously way more labor when you have to go up and down to take trays in and out. But to accomplish that, we'll use what's called a safety ladder. It's like a rolling ladder on wheels, basically, that locks into place.
Yep. I can imagine some different systems of, I'm just imagining sliding those trays down a chute right into the greens harvester. Beautiful system.
If we had 5 times the space, that might be possible. But
that would be
yeah, no, and the stairs, I actually ended up buying the stairs very early because there was no way to assemble the racking without something like that. We didn't want to do it on A-frame ladders. We needed something a little bit more secure, and without renting like a skyjack or scissor lift of some sort, the stairs were invaluable and have been for different contractors that we've had in and such.
great. Yeah. So I wonder about, I have a list of questions here. One thing that's coming to mind is, so this is a big space expansion. One of the things that's also going to grow with that space are energy costs. You're heating more space, you're cooling more space, which in a city like Toronto, I mean, you get the extremes on both ends, or sorry, Guelph at this point, but
Yeah.
same region. So I wonder, did you do any projections or looking at, okay, we're going to pay a certain amount of rent for this new space, but what is our energy costing going to look like? Did you do any projections that way, or just let's just see what happens? So did you have a sense of what those costs would be like before moving in?
There's no way around them. So I didn't really do a ton of projecting. You need lights and you need environmental management, right? So you need cooling, heating, humidity control, all those things. That was going to be what it was going to be. So I didn't really factor that in. I did just reach out to another one of my mentors who we modeled our system after to get an estimate from them of what they were paying on a monthly basis for their bills. Obviously going to be slightly different hydro companies, slightly different regions, what have you. But yeah, the cost increase is very significant. Also, and it was also not so important for me, and this is going to be very unique to my situation, but in our previous commercial space, our utilities were included in our monthly rent. And then we did a reconciliation at the end of the year. If the bills were higher, we had to cover that. If they were lower, we got a refund, that kind of thing. So I didn't really have a good sense of what our monthly hydro bills were. Now I do. It is significant, but I wouldn't say that it's so significant that it's a big pain for us. It's one of those costs that we have to bear, one of those overhead costs that we have to bear.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm wondering about, as part of the transition, what were some of the biggest unexpected challenges? Because I know you would have gone in knowing a lot of stuff, but no matter how good you prepare and vision and do all that stuff, you get to a certain point and you're like, F bomb. This never crossed my mind. Like it's not, it's one of those things that sometimes makes you go, shit, this space isn't going to work after all. Or it's just like, this is going to be a difficult thing to overcome. I know there would have been minor versions of that. I wonder what the biggest challenge or what some of the challenges were that you might anticipate other growers would run into, even if they are being really well prepared.
That's a kind of a difficult question to answer because situations are going to be so unique. The thing that comes to mind is just dealing with our municipality and how difficult the process of the building permit and closing inspections and closing off that building permit. That was very difficult, managing contractors and making sure they're working as fast and as you need them to be to get where you need to be. So I think those things are going to be completely situational. You may have a good crowd contractor, you may have a bad contractor, you may have a municipality that's easier or more difficult to work with than mine. Those are going to be very situational, but those were definitely big things that I had no clue. And then, of course, also we bought new lights than the ones we had before. We are transitioning from hand watering to automated watering. There's all these systems that we're changing, like growing systems. So obviously, not just the difference in how often we're watering, for example, but the resulting challenges of learning those growing processes. When you're hand watering, you're giving those plants exactly as much water as you know they need for that 24-hour period or whatever your watering frequency is. But with the type of system we have, which is flood and drain, those trays are getting saturated and then you're letting that evaporate over a number of days before you water them again. The plants are going to react very differently to those different situations. So, and while you're trying to juggle 1,000 other things, this core aspect of growing also needs to be a big focus. So that was a huge transition and is ongoing. We're approaching 1 year growing in the space, and we're still working on that because for me, quality is always number one. The quality of our product is everything, is just such a core part of our brand that I don't take chances. So everything has to be super meticulous, and that just takes way more time than you think it's going to take. There have been staffing challenges when you're moving into a bigger space and you have way more work to do and you have to hustle and get more sales and more clients because you need to pay for the increased costs that you have. You need more labor. You need more, your labor increases, so you need more staff. And managing people is, man, it is the most difficult thing. If it was just me and the plants, that would be relatively easy compared to managing people. But that at a certain point, it is what it is. And then, yeah, the upcoming challenge that I wasn't quite prepared for was just how quickly we might get to some space concerns. Not so much with our growing system, but I built our walk-in cooler to a certain size, and we store all of our seeds in there, but we also store our harvested product in there. What happens if we outgrow that? I don't have space to build a second walk-in cooler. What happens when the germination tent is full up? Where are we going to put another germination tent, or how do we accommodate those things? I thought, oh, we have plenty of room, but we don't. And so we're going to have to start getting creative again, just like we did in the last space with solving those problems. But yeah, that kind of gives you a bit of a picture of some of the challenges in the past and present and future.
Yeah, no, when I think about moving spaces, I've grown in probably a dozen different spaces. And the thing that is lucky about my transitions into those spaces is I always had a break in production. There was always a reason that I was moving spaces, and I didn't have to do production. I imagine from May to September 2023, you did not want to tell your restaurants, sorry, we're moving spaces. You're just going to have to go without product for a while. So I wonder if you can talk about, you're trying to move spaces and you need to maintain production. You've got
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
for the podcast listeners, I've got a good nod for a nod and some memories going through Jacob's head here. I can see in the video. So I wonder if you can talk about what were your strategies there,
Yeah.
and like how did that play out to maintain that production and maintain the sales avenue that is funding this transition?
Yeah, you're bringing up some painful memories there, Chris. Thank you for that.
That's why we do this, Jacob. Nobody wants feel-good stories on the
That's right.
internet. They all
That's
want,
right.
yeah. So bring on the pain here.
Yeah, microgreen growers are sadists, obviously. So, or maybe more masochists. But anyway, yeah, I've never had a break. I guess I had a break partially during lockdown because nobody was taking microgreens pretty much, and that was during a time when we had moved. Like that was one of the moves, but that was before the commercial space. But yeah, I don't know that I had much of a strategy other than get the new system up and running as quickly as possible so that we can make the switch. And then really it's just you go from planting seeds at one location to another location. And we were actually I was actually having for maybe only a couple of weeks because was this an issue, but I was like ferrying trays from one location to another for harvest. But yeah, really it was just like all the longest growing crops were the first ones that we planted in the new space. So as we're decommissioning the old space, the new space is online. And at a certain point, I'm like telling my employee, okay, you're working at this space today, you're working at this space today, and what we need to accomplish. So it really was a juggling act. And luckily at that point, my employee, I only had the one employee at the time, and she was essentially doing everything except for we were there together doing the harvest with another one or two people just for the harvest day, and then I'm doing the deliveries. But she was doing all the washing, she was doing all the planting, so I could be at the other space building and get everything there. So we obviously had the contractors doing the construction work, doing the electrical work, but other than that, for the most part, for 90% of the build was just myself and one of my good buddies who I was essentially just paying cash in hand to do the physical building of the pallet racking, putting the flood tables in place, doing all of the plumbing, hanging the lights. All of that stuff had to happen in those months. And it was hairy. It was a lot of work, but I was very daunted by the thought of telling established clients that I wouldn't be able to service them for some unknown amount of time. And just because of the nature of our sales cycle and the growth cycle, if I were to shut down my facility, it's not just the length of time that it's shut down, it's also the length of the however many weeks it takes to grow that variety. So I could say, oh, I need to shut for 2 weeks, but it's actually going to be 5 or 6 weeks before we're going to get some of those varieties back, or longer potentially. So yeah, juggling two spaces at once is not ideal, but it is definitely possible. I've done it several times, and it just takes, I would say, dedication more than anything else. You can plan as much as you want. Wrenches are going to get thrown at you. But if you're dedicated and you have the vision, then you just go in and execute.
Are there some key things in retrospect you can look back on and go, oh man, we could have done this? And that became maybe obvious in retrospect that might be useful. I've seen growers do transitions where they've got everything on the wheeled rack. They wrap it in plastic and everything just goes right over. And in a way, that's not a bad system. They're only going to spend a little time in transport and in less than ideal conditions. I wonder if there's some things you're like, oh yeah, man, now that we've done, this is how we could have dealt with some of these issues more effectively.
Yeah, that's a very good question. I don't know how we could have done it a lot better than we did. The big learning that I got is more about not introducing too many new factors when it comes to moving into a new space. So the space itself is new. So it's a new environment, more, for example, this is a bigger space, taller ceilings, way more volume. The temperature and humidity, just the environmental factor, are going to be completely different from a relatively tight 10-foot ceiling, tiny space, right? So you're getting used to that. But then we also decided to introduce new lights and a bale breaker, and a bunch of other things that complicated. So when we were having issues with certain crops, for example, in the new space, it was really hard to pinpoint what was causing those problems, because is it the lights? Is it the environment? What is it? So I would say I would have loved to have had more time to test growing the different crops in the new space before we were into production. We had no time to do that. It was just, we've got production trays at the old space. Now we've got production trays at the new space. There was no gap there. There was no time for testing. And again, I had hoped that 3 months was enough time to do everything. 4 months was enough time to do everything. But then we were creeping into the time when we need to be out of our old space. And we were there, we were ready to grow, but we hadn't had time to do more testing.
And were you planting buffer crops to alleviate any challenges you might have to make sure you had sufficient yields?
Yeah, we were trying to bake in a bit of a buffer on the crops. We always do to a certain degree, especially for some crops more than others. My philosophy is, my growing philosophy, production philosophy is very lean and mean. Like we do not grow a lot of extra stuff. My client, and maybe this is a bit of a liability for me, but I have fairly understanding clients. We rarely run into issues where we have to short people or whatever, but generally if we have a problem with a certain crop and we have to, it's not sellable for whatever reason, generally clients are fairly understanding. But I don't like to plant extra just for the sake of it, because it ends up, I don't want to say being waste, because we don't just throw it away, but it's cost, right? It's added cost. With the additive method that we use, we grow just about enough. We grow a little bit extra, so I have stuff for samples when I'm prospecting, but that's about it. So we don't usually have a ton of buffer.